time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The decision was delivered without ceremony, without negotiation, and without the smallest hint that another chance would follow. Charles had reached the end of an argument that had quietly shadowed the palace for months. With one final instruction, Meghan's remaining private connection to the royal household was terminated. But the greater explosion came hundreds of miles away, when Harry learned exactly what his father had done. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles signed the final palace directive himself. In this dramatized account, the directive was a written household order ending Meghan's last informal administrative link to senior palace staff, including the private route once used to pass requests between California and London. That channel mattered because it had survived earlier disagreements. The king had kept it open, convinced that one remaining bridge might someday make family conversations easier for Harry and the wider household. Charles did not celebrate when the pen left the page. He set it down and said nothing. The monarch understood exactly what he had done. This was not another adjustment to palace procedure. It was the moment when patience became finality. The king had chosen a boundary his younger son would feel as a wound. Harry received the news privately and reacted immediately. He demanded to know why Meghan had not been warned directly and why the final connection had disappeared without another conversation. To the prince, the decision did not feel administrative. It felt personal. His wife had already lost the public role she once held, and now the quiet route remaining behind the scenes was gone. Harry's anger sharpened when he learned that Meghan could no longer use the trusted intermediary who had carried messages between the two sides. Then came the detail that changed everything. Harry was told that Charles had personally authorized the order. No committee had forced his hand. No anonymous courtier could be blamed. His father had made the choice. In a documented account created for this fictionalized narrative, the decision was described as deliberate and irreversible. That made the prince more furious, because the person he wanted to confront was not an institution. It was the man he still called his father. Harry decided he would demand that conversation. Yet before he could make the call, another truth surfaced. Charles had not closed the final connection without a trigger. Something specific had happened, serious enough to turn hesitation into action. Harry believed the order was the beginning of the story. But inside the palace, everyone knew it was actually the consequence of something far more personal. Behind the royal titles were three people carrying three different versions of the same history. Charles believed he had preserved opportunities for reconciliation long after trust had weakened. Meghan saw palace restrictions as evidence that she would never truly be allowed back inside the royal circle, and Harry stood between them, convinced that every boundary placed around his wife was ultimately a boundary placed around him. Harry paced through a private conversation that night, unable to accept how quickly the last connection had disappeared. The prince told a confidant that Meghan's remaining palace route had meant more than access to staff. It was the final practical sign that she could still reach the royal household without every personal question becoming a formal exchange. The royal household is the network of staff and offices supporting the monarch and senior family members. To him, closing that route felt like closing another piece of family life. Meghan heard the anger in his voice, but she carried a different fear. She believed the decision confirmed what she had long suspected. Once distance became policy, returning to any normal relationship with the palace would become almost impossible. Harry insisted his father was turning an administrative boundary into punishment. She did not fully agree, but she understood why he felt betrayed. Because the route had survived previous arguments when almost everything else had fallen away. Charles spoke with William and admitted that he expected his son to react badly. The king explained that calls, meetings, and separation between family matters and palace business had defined their relationship for months. William listened before warning that the unofficial route was creating confusion. The future king said staff no longer knew whether certain requests were personal, ceremonial, or attempts to reach royal resources through a side door. Charles then revealed the detail that shifted the conversation. In a documented account created for this dramatized narrative, he explained that several recent requests had arrived through the private channel, even though it had been preserved only for family communication. The monarch had tolerated uncertainty, but one request carried Meghan's name and crossed a boundary he had personally set months earlier. William understood immediately why his father believed the arrangement could no longer continue. Harry did not know exactly what that request contained. Meghan knew only that something had changed the king's patience into certainty. That missing detail became the most dangerous part of the dispute, because once it surfaced, the argument could no longer be reduced to hurt feelings. The final order did not begin with anger in London. It began with one specific request that forced Charles to decide whether the old rules still meant anything. For months, the remaining communication line had existed because Charles believed private family dialogue deserved protection. Then came one request that changed its meaning entirely. It arrived quietly, passed through the same trusted route that had survived every dispute. Yet when the king read what was being asked, the atmosphere changed. The channel meant to protect reconciliation had suddenly become the source of the palace's deepest concern. Charles had allowed an intermediary to carry only personal messages involving family contact, scheduling questions, and sensitive matters he wanted kept private. An intermediary, in this dramatized account, meant a trusted go-between who passed messages without acting as an official royal office. That distinction mattered, because the arrangement survived only on trust. Once requests began touching palace resources, ceremonial access, and official engagements, staff feared the private bridge was becoming something it had never been meant to be. Charles felt that fear become real during a private Windsor briefing. An aide placed one request before him and explained that Meghan had asked, through the remaining channel, for information linked to an upcoming royal charitable engagement, even though she held no formal role in the event. A royal charitable engagement is an official activity connected with a cause supported by a working member of the family. The king read it twice. Then he asked whether the request might have been misunderstood. The answer changed everything. According to a documented account created for this fictionalized narrative, the aide told Charles the wording was explicit and that the request had bypassed an earlier instruction requiring all non-family matters to use formal channels. The monarch closed the folder. His response was controlled, but final. A private family bridge could not operate as an alternative royal office. That sentence turned months of tension into a decision. Harry rejected that interpretation when he later heard what had happened. The prince argued that Meghan was seeking clarity about a cause she had once supported, not trying to reclaim authority. He believed the palace had taken ordinary curiosity and treated it like a breach of trust. She shared his frustration, insisting that asking for information was not the same as demanding a role. But neither could erase the fact that the boundary had already been communicated. Charles no longer saw room for another warning. The king summoned his younger son for a private conversation, knowing that this time there would be no intermediary, no careful message passed between offices, and no ambiguity about who had made the decision. What had begun as an argument over access was now heading towards something painfully simple. A father and son sitting across from one another with nowhere left to hide. There were no cameras, no public statements, and no room full of advisors to soften the words. When Harry finally confronted Charles, the discussion moved almost immediately beyond palace procedure. Years of frustration crowded into the room. Meghan's access was the subject, but beneath it sat every older wound: the departures, the interviews, the silences, the accusations, and the stubborn belief on both sides that the other had never truly listened. Charles had agreed to speak privately because he wanted his son to hear the decision from him, not from staff. The king knew this was no longer simply about palace procedure, meaning the internal rules that govern how royal offices operate and who may use them. Harry entered believing the remaining connection could still be restored. The prince was convinced that if his father understood Meghan's request as harmless curiosity rather than an attempt to regain influence, the order might be reversed. Harry asked the question without easing into it. Why had Meghan been cut off without another warning? Charles answered that warnings had already been given, and that private access could not be used to avoid the responsibilities that came with stepping away from official royal duties. His son pushed his chair back. The prince accused the palace of applying rules selectively, protecting some people while punishing others. The king did not raise his voice. He simply said the decision was about boundaries, not revenge. Charles then revealed something Harry had not expected. According to a documented account created for this dramatized narrative, the monarch explained that senior staff had previously recommended closing the channel, but he had resisted them. He had kept it alive because he believed one protected route might preserve family contact even when public relations had collapsed. The king had not been Meghan's enemy in that argument. He had been the reason the door remained open. Harry went quiet for a moment, and that silence carried more pain than the shouting before it. His father had protected the connection once. Now the same man was ending it. The prince realized he could no longer dismiss the decision as anonymous palace hostility. Charles had made the choice personally, and he had made it after defending the arrangement for months. That distinction mattered because it stripped away the comforting explanation Harry had left, that faceless courtiers were driving the conflict. Harry left furious, still believing pressure might force another reversal. But the king had already prepared the next step, and it would show that this was never an impulsive reaction. Harry walked away believing anger might still reverse the decision, but Charles had already placed the matter beyond the reach of anger. Royal power rarely announces itself through shouting. More often, it appears in a signature, a closed channel, or a sentence delivered so calmly that its finality becomes unmistakable. Charles understood that removing Meghan's last palace connection would be interpreted emotionally. Yet inside the household, the question was narrower. Who was entitled to authorize access, and who had the authority to withdraw it? William found his father unusually quiet after the confrontation with Harry. The prince asked whether the argument had changed anything, and Charles answered with painful precision it had changed how the decision felt, but not what the decision had to be. The remaining connection was never a constitutional right, meaning it was not a protection guaranteed by the legal structure governing the monarchy. It existed because the household had voluntarily preserved an informal route after Harry and Meghan stepped away from working royal duties. Charles knew that distinction gave him the practical authority to end the arrangement once its purpose had changed. The king had allowed the route to survive because it was supposed to protect private family communication, not create another path into palace business. William understood why that mattered. The future king had watched confusion grow whenever personal requests crossed into official territory, and he warned that leaving the arrangement untouched would only create another argument later. Charles then admitted what the decision was costing him. In a documented account created for this dramatized narrative, the monarch told William that institutional clarity had forced him to separate two roles he desperately wished could remain together: father and sovereign. A sovereign is the reigning monarch who carries responsibility for the crown and its household. The king could still love his son, while refusing to let that love blur the rules surrounding palace access. William heard the sadness beneath those words, and he knew his father was not describing victory. The order became harder, almost immediately. Charles instructed senior staff that any future communication involving Meghan and official palace matters must pass through clearly established external channels, not private intermediaries. The king made the boundary unmistakable. Yet he did something else at the same time. He preserved a separate personal route through which Harry could still contact him directly. That distinction was deliberate. Charles had closed an administrative door, not the relationship with his son. William recognized the importance of that choice, but Harry did not see it yet. The prince was still consumed by the fact that Meghan had lost her final palace connection, and his anger was moving faster than his understanding. Charles had drawn a careful line between Meghan's palace access and Harry's place as his son, but anger was about to erase that distinction completely. Harry did not experience the decision as a technical adjustment. He experienced it as humiliation. The final palace connection had carried little public authority, yet emotionally it represented something enormous. Proof that Meghan had not been completely removed from the world he had once called home. When that connection disappeared, his reaction was immediate, and what he did next showed how deeply the decision had struck. Harry returned from the confrontation, convinced that Charles had used palace procedure to send a wider message about Meghan's place in the family. The prince believed the argument was no longer about one channel or one request. Palace procedure, in this dramatized narrative, meant the internal rules controlling access, communication, and official business within the royal household. To him, those rules now felt like a wall being built around his wife, and he could not separate that wall from his own sense of rejection. Meghan listened as he repeated every line from the meeting, but she reacted with a quieter kind of pain. She understood almost immediately that the remaining route was unlikely to return. Harry kept searching for a way to challenge the decision, while she focused on what the order already meant. When written confirmation arrived, the prince dropped his phone onto the table and said his father had decided everything before truly hearing his side. Meghan urged him not to turn the dispute into another public battle. She warned that attacking the palace would only strengthen the belief that private boundaries could never remain private. Harry resisted. He argued that silence would look like surrender, and that accepting the order without protest would allow others to define what had happened. She answered that fighting every boundary could cost him something far more personal than palace access. Then Harry noticed the detail he had almost missed. His direct personal route to Charles remained open. According to a documented account created for this fictionalized story, the king had specifically preserved that channel even while closing Meghan's administrative connection. The discovery confused the prince, because it contradicted the story he had built in his mind, that his father wanted a total break. That single fact changed the emotional ground. Meghan understood the distinction before he did. Charles had closed her institutional door, but he had deliberately left the father-son door unlocked. She told Harry that the next move would reveal what he truly wanted: to keep fighting the palace, or to speak to his father without titles, staff, or old arguments standing between them. For the first time since the order was signed, the question was no longer what Charles had taken away, but what Harry might still choose to preserve. The second conversation was nothing like the first. There were no arguments about staff, no discussion of palace procedure, and no attempt to reverse the order. Harry approached his father with only one question left. Did removing Meghan's final royal connection mean Charles was removing them from his life as well? The answer would not restore what had been lost, but it would determine what remained between father and son. Harry used the personal route Charles had deliberately left open after the administrative connection was closed. The prince understood that this route was different from palace access. It was simply a private line between family members, carrying no official authority or institutional privilege. That distinction mattered because the argument had begun around rules, But now both men agreed to speak without advisors, staff, or intermediaries standing between them. Harry asked the question directly. Did his father want Meghan permanently excluded from family contact? Charles answered with equal clarity. The king said family relationships and palace privileges were separate matters, and mixing them together had helped create the confusion they were now trying to untangle. He could close an institutional door without pretending his son had stopped being his son. The monarch's words were firm, but they no longer carried the sharpness of their first confrontation. Charles then said something that stopped the argument completely. According to a recorded conversation created for this dramatized narrative, he told Harry that loving a son did not require restoring every privilege attached to the royal life that son had chosen to leave. The prince did not push his chair back this time. He did not raise his voice. He simply became quiet, because the statement forced him to confront a difference he had resisted from the beginning. Rejection and consequence were not necessarily the same thing. Charles confirmed that he had protected Harry's direct personal access intentionally. The king refused to turn an institutional disagreement into an act of disowning his son, even when anger made that separation difficult to maintain. Harry did not apologize for defending Meghan, and he made clear that he would always protect his wife. But the prince acknowledged that he had interpreted the order more broadly than his father intended. Something shifted between them. Nothing was repaired completely, and Meghan's palace connection remained closed, but the conflict no longer felt like a total family severance. Charles had drawn the line. Harry finally understood where it was. Inside the family, the temperature had finally begun to fall. But outside the palace walls, the story was about to erupt. By morning, a private decision had become a public symbol. To some, Charles had finally established a boundary that should have existed years earlier. To others, removing Meghan's final palace connection appeared unnecessarily severe. But one image captured the entire argument better than any commentator could. Crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace, as headlines declared that the last informal bridge had been closed. Harry watched the morning coverage and felt the argument escaping his control. The prince saw broadcasters reduce weeks of private tension to a single question. Had Charles protected the monarchy, or pushed reconciliation even further away? Buckingham Palace, the monarch's principal London residence and administrative headquarters, had become the focus because every discussion about access now seemed to lead back to its gates. Meghan sat beside him and warned that answering every criticism would only feed the conflict. He listened, but staying silent felt almost impossible. Charles received his own briefing as public reaction intensified. The king heard that commentators were dividing the decision into two camps: those who believed clear institutional boundaries were overdue, and those who believed another fragile family bridge had been destroyed. According to a documented briefing created for this dramatized narrative, he refused to reconsider the directive. The monarch did not sound triumphant. He sounded exhausted, because every attempt to create clarity seemed to produce another emotional cost. Outside Buckingham Palace, the argument suddenly gained a symbol. Tourists and royal watchers gathered near newspaper boards carrying variations of the same dramatic message: Final Palace Link Cut. Television cameras lingered on the gates, while presenters described them as the physical line between private family connection and official royal access. The crowd itself was divided. Some defended the king's decision. Others called it unnecessarily final. That split mattered, because the story was no longer being judged only by the people who had lived through it. Harry noticed something else in the coverage. Palace messaging repeatedly emphasized that his personal contact with Charles remained intact. The prince understood immediately why that detail had been included. It challenged the most dramatic claim that father and son had completely severed ties. Meghan recognized the same thing. She reminded him that the distinction he had struggled to accept privately was now being explained publicly. The noise reached its peak, but the real decision still belonged to three people. Charles could hold the boundary without turning it into rejection. Harry could defend his wife without destroying the relationship with his father. Meghan could accept that one door had closed without demanding that every other door close with it. The world saw a palace door closing, but the final meaning of the decision would be determined by what Charles, Harry, and Meghan chose not to destroy afterward. In the end, Charles's decision did exactly what royal boundaries are designed to do. It ended uncertainty. Meghan no longer possessed an informal route into palace operations. Harry remained furious that the connection had been removed, but he could no longer claim that his father had erased him personally. The distinction was painful, imperfect, and impossible to celebrate, yet it finally gave everyone something the relationship had lacked for years: clarity. Meghan accepted that the old arrangement would not return. She understood that future non-family matters would now have to travel through ordinary external channels, meaning formal routes outside the private palace network rather than personal access to royal staff. That mattered because the final connection had once blurred two worlds: family communication and institutional privilege. Now the line between them had been made permanent, and she knew fighting that line would only drag Harry back into the same conflict. Harry listened as Meghan urged him not to sacrifice whatever relationship remained with his father, simply to defend a palace role she no longer held. The prince did not surrender his loyalty to his wife, but he finally recognized what Charles had preserved. His most important remaining connection was not an intermediary, an office, or a hidden route through staff. It was the direct path to his father, and that path was still open. Charles carried the cost of that choice quietly. The king knew protecting the monarchy had disappointed his son, yet reversing the directive would recreate the very uncertainty that had caused the crisis. In a documented account created for this dramatized narrative, he described the decision as painful but necessary. The monarch had separated affection from authority, and for once, he refused to let guilt erase the boundary he had drawn. Harry finally understood the verdict. Meghan had lost her last informal palace connection, but she had gained certainty about where she stood. The prince remained protective of her, yet he also accepted that family love could survive without restoring institutional access, influence, or unofficial privilege. Charles had chosen clarity over ambiguity, not because the decision was easy, but because continuing the old arrangement would have guaranteed another rupture. No one had won, but everyone finally understood what remained afterward, and that became the true meaning of the decision. Charles closed the last unofficial palace door, but he refused to close the door between father and son. For a family damaged repeatedly by blurred lines, that boundary was not reconciliation, but it was finally an ending they could understand. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.